Well, as Ryan mentioned, I'm pulling away from Luke. We've been studying Luke's gospel. We're 10 chapters deep, and we got a ways to go. But we're pulling away from that because of the election. In all honesty, I don't know how anybody that's paying any attention at all wouldn't be at least somewhat concerned about what's going on in our nation, and particularly about what will happen this Tuesday. Both sides are already preparing for legal contesting of the results, whichever way it goes. Some groups are already threatening violence depending on the results. And I say all that, I came to be encouraged today. Thank you, Pastor, very much for talking about these things. Well, that's why we're looking at Psalm 90. That on top of COVID-19, on top of race issues that still are so prominent in our nation, I think it would be natural for people to have anger or angst or anxiety, and I haven't even gotten out of the A's in our thesaurus. And this is here's my first word of encouragement. This is a glorious opportunity for Christians to shine as lights in the midst of crooked and perverse generations. And I think we could do that any number of ways. But I hope that Psalm 90 will help us in at least one way this morning. Now, we're in the Psalms. The Psalms are poetry, Hebrew poetry. I am the last guy in the room that should be trying to explain Hebrew poetry. I am not an expert. I'm the furthest thing from an expert. But it is poetry, and I think it's important that we recognize that and acknowledge that as we start. This is not a syllogism. The syllogism is a logical argument. It starts with a major premise, moves to a minor premise, and then comes with a conclusion. And so I acknowledge to you, I'm not a poet. I probably am more comfortable in the realm of logic. This is not logic. It's poetry. It's emotive. But I'm still going to use syllogistic lingo. In fact, I'm going to move through the three parts of Psalm 90, thinking of them in terms of a major premise, verses 1 and 2, a minor premise, verses 3 to 11, and then conclusions in verses 12 to 17. All right? So that's my outline. That's how I'm going to work through the text. There's a major premise, verses 1 and 2. There's a minor premise, verses 3 to 11, and then there are conclusions in verses 12 to 17. I've just botched that so badly I've got you all confused, but let's just start with the major premise, verses 1 and 2. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, just briefly, the major premise starts with God. You are God. You see that in the last line of this poetry. You are God. I thought it might be helpful. Isaac Watts, who wrote so many hymns that probably can't count them, but one of the things that Watts did, and we sing some of his hymns still today, but Watts, it's not really a translation of the hymns as much as almost like an interpretation into the metrical psalms so that they could be sung in English. And one of his hymns based on Psalm 90, in fact, it's a hymn that I grew up singing. It's a great old hymn. But the first three verses of this hymn correspond to the first two verses of Psalm 90. And I thought it might be helpful just for me to go back and forth and read these and maybe give you some insight or might spark something in you. Here's Watts on Psalm 90. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, thy saints have dwelt secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Before the hills in order stood, or earth received her frame, from everlasting thou art God, to endless years the same. That's Psalm 90, verses 1 and 2. We've read that. We've read Watts. Now here's my attempt here I think is the major premise of the psalm. The eternal God is a secure dwelling place in and for changing times. The eternal God is a secure dwelling place in and for changing times. Clearly, this is about God's eternality. God, or His eternity, if you prefer that word. That's the last line, from everlasting to everlasting. Always. And we need to tie closely together in our minds the fact that God is everlasting or that He's eternal with the fact that He's unchangeable. Those two truths are very closely linked, and I'll show you in a second. So here you have this, I said, the eternal God is a secure dwelling place, right? That's the first line. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. God, in other words, in all generations, it's like God is our permanent address, right? Like, when young people go away to college, for example, they might have to fill stuff out, and they have to fill out their permanent address, and then they have to fill out their temporary address. Well, it's really important for Christians to get clear which is our permanent address and which is our temporary address, because too often we think and live as if our temporary address is permanent. But this world is not our home. And if I could... Some of you are going to be upset with me because you're going to think I'm unpatriotic and un-American. But here's the reality. The United States of America is not our home. Not if we're really believers. The Lord is our dwelling place. He is our permanent address. The eternal God is a secure dwelling place in and for changing times. And certainly that's where we live, isn't it? He is our dwelling place. What's the second line of verse 1? In all generations. So generations come and go. People come and go. Nations come and go. Kings and presidents come and go. But the Lord is the same in all of those changes. And He is our dwelling place. This reminds me of a book that I recently read by Matthew Barrett. It's called None Greater. And that's a shortened version of what he calls the core conviction of the book. Now, this is worded unusually for the way we talk today. It's actually based on Anselm, one of the church fathers. But here's the core conviction of that book. God is someone than whom none greater can be conceived. God is someone than whom none greater can be conceived. So he shortens for the title, None Greater. No one is greater than God. In fact, no one could even be conceived as greater than God. This is tied to what we often call big God theology. Can I tell you, Psalm 90, this sermon, in light of the election and all of the, I think John called it tumultuous times, easy for me to say, tumultuous times in which we live, we need a big God. Now, He is a big God, but we need a big God theology. We need a vision, a view, an understanding of a big God. Here are some snippets from Barrett's book, which I would commend to you, by the way. I loved the book. Barrett said, He is not a God who simply possesses our powers, but in endless measure. And he's talking about that in the context of superheroes. Like, God is not just a superhero. Like He's like us, but better. Like, we have some strength, but He has more. or we have some wisdom, but He has more. No, no, no. God is altogether different from us. He's not like us. And when we try to compare God to us, when we try to think of God in terms of who we are but better, we are shrinking Him down. That is not big God. That's a very small God. Because I don't care how much better I get, I am still, listen, infinitely less than God is. Infinitely less. Right? And so Barrett says, as you work through the book, He is a different type of being. If we can think of anything that would limit God, then it cannot be true of God. I love that line. If we can think of anything that would limit God, it's not true. That's why when we talk about the attributes of God, we have those omnis, right? You know the omni attributes of God, you know what I'm talking about? He is omnipresent. He is omniscient. He is omnipotent. That is unlimited. And all. Some people, they play word games. It's really just semantics. For example, you know that question that they think this gotcha question, or at least what some people think is a gotcha question. Could God create a rock so big that He couldn't lift it? Well, that's just semantics, folks. That's really not a hard question to answer. Can I tell you? Because here's the thing. Can I rephrase the question? Are we going to limit God in His creative power or in His strength to lift something? And the answer is you can't limit God in either of those areas. It's like asking somebody if you stop beating your wife. The question is faulty at the beginning because it assumes you can limit God in one or the other area, and you can't. He's limitless. The minute you think of something that could limit God, you've thought of something that's untrue. He's a big God. He is awesome. And so He's infinite in time. He's everlasting. He's immutable. He's unchangeable. He's awesome. And it almost seems like something happens between verses 2 and 3, doesn't it? I mean, if we're just honest, verses 1 and 2 are kind of warm and fuzzy, and then you get to this next session, what I'm calling the minor premise, and you're going, what happened to the psalmist? I mean, did he have a bad day? Did he take a break? How do we get from verse 2 to verse 3? How do we get from the major premise to the minor premise? And Barrett says it this way. Here's the issue. We have sinned against the one who is infinite in His perfections. Every single person in this room has sinned against a big God. Against one who's not just big, but who's infinite in all of, not just in His knowledge, omniscience, or in His presence, omnipresent, but in all of His perfections. He's infinite, and we've sinned against Him. We've offended Him. We've rebelled against Him, and that leads us to the minor premise in verses 3 to 11. Listen to this. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it's past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They're like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath. We are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We will bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? The God who is from everlasting to everlasting, God is ticked off. And that's terrifying. And we don't like to think about God's wrath, talk about it. We don't like to even talk about the reasons that God would be wrathful, i.e., sin. We don't like to talk about the results of God's wrath, according to this passage, death. And so so that's where we fail, is in verse 11. What's this word? Who considers? Do you see that? Who considers? We don't consider. We don't like to think about death. We dress death up. We say silly things like, oh, death is a natural part of life. Death is the opposite of life. Death is the absence of life. Death is not a natural part of life. That's what our world wants to think. It's not true. We don't consider death. We don't consider sin. We don't really understand and think about the depth and the depravity of our sin or the awfulness of death. But the logical progression of this section, this minor premise, is it goes from iniquity to anger or wrath because of that iniquity. 5 times, I tried to punch it as I read. Did you notice? 5 times the word anger or wrath used in this section. Iniquity, our iniquity, produces God's wrath, which results or should result in fear. Who considers the power of your anger? Verse 11, and your wrath according to the fear of you. That's what ought to happen if we would think, if we would consider, if we would just pay attention. Our iniquities resulting in God's anger should lead to our fear of God. Fear does not stand in contradiction to verses 1 and 2. That's what ought to happen. Can I read again Watts? Maybe Watts would shed some light on this for us or help us to see it a little more clearly. Here are Watts' his interpretation, his hymn of this. He said, "Thy word commands our flesh to dust. Return, ye sons of men, all nations." It's interesting to me that Watts goes to nations. And I would encourage us to think in the same way. I'll tell you how in a minute. All nations rose from earth at first and turned to earth again. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. The busy tribes of flesh and blood with all their lives and cares are carried downwards by the flood and lost in following years. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its sons away. They fly, forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day. Like flowery fields, the nations stand, pleased with the morning light. The flowers beneath the mower's hand lie withering ere it's night. Here's my crack at the minor premise. Our changing times are due to God's anger against our sin. We live in a sin-cursed world. We live in a world that's characterized by death and toil and trouble. Verse 10. We live in a world because of sin that has resulted in God's anger or wrath. And what does God's anger or wrath look like? It looks like this sin-cursed world. It looks like a world that's characterized by the brevity, the frailty, and the uncertainty of life. That's verses 3 through 11. The brevity, the frailty, and the uncertainty of life, and according to Watts, if he's right, and I think he is, even of nations, of groups, of corporateness. And that anger or wrath should lead to a fear of God. Another book that I have been reading recently is Daniel Strange's book. It's called Plugged In. His illustration is so good, I didn't even want to paraphrase it because I was afraid I would miss something important and something helpful to you. So I'm going to read just a page out of Strange's book titled Plugged In. He's talking about the wrath or the anger of God. And here's how he illustrates it. He says, imagine a big canvas stretched out to give shelter to those underneath. over time, gallons and gallons of water are poured onto this sheet, and it starts to collect. It gets heavier and heavier, and the sheet slowly starts to sag under the weight of all that water. Those underneath think everything's okay. There's no problem. They just roll over and go back to sleep. But in reality, there's a huge problem. That sheet gets heavier and heavier. And as it does, the water keeps on collecting. And then comes that awful moment when the whole thing comes crashing in. The day of God's wrath will be that cosmic crashing in. There is a final day of wrath. But all humanity experiences God's wrath now as well. It's as if God has taken out a penknife and has cut a little slit in the canvas, and drops of wrath are falling down. Why would God do that? It sounds bleak, but it's actually a gracious warning sign. It's God telling us that something has gone terribly wrong. God tells us about it in lots of ways. It's in little things like a stubbed toe or a broken phone, or in the reality that your living room gets messy but it never gets tidy without your intervention. But it's in the big things too. He tells us all about it in all the frustration and brokenness and dysfunction we see in the world, in all the ways we go against God's design. We see it in disaster and disease and dishonesty, but supremely, we see it in death. And he goes on to talk about Psalm 90. God is graciously warning us. Actually, Strange goes on to call it's a little taste of hell on earth. I don't like to think that way, but that's exactly what God's wrath now looks like. Not even always because of personal sin, but just because of the fact that we live in a sin-cursed world. And God is showing us, again, how seriously we should take sin because of these drops of wrath, because of death. We should definitely take death more seriously, and because of that, we should take sin more seriously. We should consider. Now, let me encourage you to think about that in corporate terms, like Watts did as he thinks about Psalm 90. There's an interesting contrast in this section between 1,000 years and between 70 or 80 years. 1,000 years are nothing to God, and yet we only live 70 to 80 years. And God's trying to highlight, you're not everlasting to everlasting. I am. I'm a big God. You guys don't get it. And some Americans, some Christian Americans, can I just say, are just, again, excuse me being unpatriotic, but we're just way too cocky. We're too arrogant. 1,000 years to God are like nothing. And America's been around for less than 250. Less than a quarter, and yet we strut around like we're all that. And some Christians are the worst about this because we think we've got some kind of divine birthright as a country. USA is not and has never been God's chosen people. That was Israel in the Old Testament. It's the church now. So we would do well as Christians to do a lot less strutting and a lot more kneeling, pleading with God for mercy, because if we're honest, we don't deserve any goodness from God's hand. Our sins as a nation are before God. And what we ought to be deserving is divine, or what we ought to be expecting, what we certainly deserve, is God's judgment. You think about the election, think about the anger that Christians have right now. It shouldn't be anger that we have for anybody. Can I tell you that? It shouldn't be anger that God has a right to be angry. We don't. We should be humble. We should be prayerful. We should be pleading. We should be recognizing who we are as a nation and what we deserve. It's ironic that some of the people who hate entitlement in other people are the most entitled, as if we deserve something from God, as if we deserve for our country to continue as we want it to continue. Can I tell you, that's just not biblical. It's just not. It's not the heart of Jesus. It's not the fruit of the Spirit. It's not Christ-like. Think about those things rooted in this. Now, the third section I told you I think is conclusions, and I don't have much time to talk about these, but I think there are two. Put the major premise, God, big God. Minor premise, us, and the depth of our sin, and God's anger against us. I think there are two conclusions in verses 12 to 17. The first one is this: we should define wisdom in light of time and eternity. We should define wisdom in light of time and eternity. This is in verses 12 to 15. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Now, I would suggest to you 12 to 14 is about time. Number our days, our years. It's about time here and now. And wisdom is going to be defined, according to the inspired Word of God, by time. This is New Testament as well, isn't it? Like, for example, Colossians chapter 4 and verse 5, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, wisdom says, 70 or 80 years, I need to get busy. I need to make the best use of this. God, help me. Wisdom should be defined in light of time. But also, verse 15, wisdom should be defined in light of eternity. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Now, I suggest to you that that verse is not talking about our current lives. It's not like God promises that you're going to have as many good days as bad. Does He? Does He? If it's not true of your life, then probably you could think of somebody who'd say, well, if that was the promise, God failed miserably. People who've had a lot of heartache and suffering and trials. No. Verse 15 is not a promise that you're going to have as many good days as bad here on earth. Verse 15 it's a prayer, but it's looking forward to the fact that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be real to us, Romans 8. Our light momentary affliction is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. No matter how bad, no matter how long the suffering endures here on earth, we have eternity to look forward to that will eternity. Do you understand this? When you get to heaven, if you get to heaven, if you're a follower of Christ, or if you become a follower of Christ, even today, there's going to be a day in heaven when you're going to say, what trial? Somebody brings up suffering. I mean, think about the very worst thing that's ever happened in your entire life. You got it? That suffering is not worth comparing to the glory of eternity. And wisdom keeps that in mind. This is what maybe sometimes we call an eternal perspective, right? It's James compares the wisdom from above to the wisdom from beneath. But wisdom thinks in terms of eternity. And sometimes what God does in time is He sends those very trials in order to loosen our grip on life now and to make us long for the life that's to come. Could we just acknowledge that both conservatives and progressives don't have the wisdom to know what to conserve and how, or to know what to change and how, politics will fail miserably. God and His teaching about who He is and time and eternity will never fail to help us think correctly, to be wise in this world. Second one, and I don't have time to develop it, but I'll tell you what it is. But according to verses 16 and 17, we should determine our work based on time and eternity. We should determine our work. If I just highlight for you, God, let your work appear, and then He prays about the work of our hands. Our work should match up with God's work. And that is determined again by time and eternity. If you and I worked in politics in order to preserve our union for another few years, can I tell you something? It's not going to last forever. The United States will not be around during the millennial kingdom. You know what work is? I think, again, there's a confusion. I mentioned it earlier. A lot of Christians think that the United States of America became God's chosen people. No. God's chosen people is the church. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't pray for, love, and work in the arena of our nation, but let me tell you something. There is a work that is guaranteed to endure. At the end of 1 Corinthians 15, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is never in vain. Won't go away. It's an eternal kind of work. Well, Watts closes his hymn almost exactly like he started it, or his rewrite of Psalm 90. He says, our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guard while troubles last, and our eternal home. Lord, you are our dwelling place. There's a world of difference between that and USA, you are my dwelling place. Or, I don't know, CDC, you are my dwelling place. Or Blue Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter, you are my dwelling place. In fact, can I tell you, if the Lord is not your dwelling place, then I would understand perfectly why you'd be freaking out right now. If the USA is your dwelling place, you probably have every reason to be freaking out. Science, research, medical professionals are your dwelling place. I would be confused as anything right now. If the world's answers to the worst crises and problems and social injustices, if that's your dwelling place, then you probably should be in a panic. But if the Lord is your dwelling place, your permanent address, if our citizenship is not on earth, Philippians chapter 3, but it's in heaven. Do you know what Paul goes on to say? Philippians 4:1, that's one of those horrible chapter breaks. If our citizenship is in heaven, then we can stand. Read Philippians 4:1. Stand. We can. Even in the worst of days, the Lord is our dwelling place. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you for the chance to consider these words together this morning. God, I pray for our country. I ask for your mercy. I pray for your help. Even this Tuesday, I pray for fair and honest elections. I pray for voters. If in our form of government, if it's true that kings' hearts are in your hand and you can steer them wherever you will, certainly it's true that voters' hearts are in your hands as well. But we need a radical rethinking about some very basic social issues in our nation. We need forgiveness. We need hearts for confession. And we plead for your mercy. We confess our sin and ask for your mercy this Tuesday. We pray for our country, and I pray chiefly that your church, that your people will shine as lights, whatever happens in coming days. Give us, I pray, as your church, to shine as lights in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And we'll thank you for all of these things. In Jesus' name, amen.